So, how do you prepare for a case research project? In the background, I am showing the Writing Research Case Studies checklist, which is included as a Word document in the Canvas QRM site. And what I'm going to do now is just talk a little bit about some of those preparation steps going through the checklist as opposed to using slides. So what we'll do is we'll begin by dealing with the very first question, which is, what is your motivation for developing the case? And there are a variety of different motivations that we're talking about here. And we'll start with general classroom use. So here we're talking about a teaching case study. And this might be a study developed as part of a course where we don't really care what the content is. We might also be developing a case for a specific use. For example, when I was developing cybersecurity cases, I would often find myself looking for a case involving a specific type of situation because that would help create a complete portfolio for the class. We're not really going to talk about discussion cases anymore. I just want to mention them because when you're preparing for a case research project, a lot of the steps overlap those that you would do when preparing for discussion case development. So the next set of preparations involve research cases. And so we'll begin with exploratory research. And when you're preparing for an exploratory research case, chances are you're going to be really reasonably open for the different types of settings, but hopefully there is going to be some phenomenon that has drawn you to a particular site. So that in many cases you don't have a clear theory that you're starting out with, and often you'll hear part of a story about an organization that will make you decide that this would be a good site for case research. Now, if you're writing a theory testing case, here we're dealing with something that's a little bit different in terms of how we choose sites. In most cases, we're going to be looking for a site that is exhibiting a very specific phenomenon so that we can use it to test theory. Whereas we have a lot of flexibility when we're exploring, when we're testing, we're more likely to try to focus on finding a site that will allow us to come in and will allow us to focus on a very specific aspect of what's being observed in the case. We talked about different case research types. If it's part of a replicated case research project, it's a little bit like theory testing in that we want to find cases with very specific characteristics, and we want to build a set of cases that specifically accomplish goals, whether it be two very similar sites or two very divergent sites where we want to compare outcomes. And if you look at the case research design for replicated cases, you can see how you might go about trying to choose sites. And then finally, if it's part of a case pattern research design, you're probably going to be much less picky about the case. What you're more interested in is, does it fit within the set of other cases that you're looking at? Because the whole idea of case pattern research is that you're going to be looking at patterns within a group of cases, and ideally you won't really know what those patterns are going to turn out to be before you conduct the research. The next question you're going to want to ask yourself before engaging in a case research project is, what is the anticipated outlet for the case? There are a variety of different outlets that you could have. One might be just for local use. This is more likely to be the case for a teaching case as opposed to a research case. In a research case, most of the time you're going to be interested in actually publishing it in a journal. There's also the possibility of putting it out in an external outlet, which is not necessarily published. But when we're doing research, we will normally be interested in publishing in a journal. And that's important because it has significant implications for whether or not we want to involve an institutional review board. My experience has usually been that when you're looking for case sites, you tend to hear about them in indirect ways, through colleagues, through executive advisory boards, sometimes through the local paper. But before you make your first visit, once you've found a potential case site that seems to meet your needs, you want to do some background research on it. And that research would consist of doing web searches on the organization and on the names of any particular protagonists who might be part of the case, whether it be research or discussion. You can also look for research that has been written on the organization that you're thinking about writing about. The web is an extremely useful place to do searches, and if you're dealing with an organization, there's a very good chance they have a website that you can research. There may also be repositories. I find that even when doing research cases, it's a good idea to see if there are any cases on that organization within the HBS library and some of the other libraries, such as the Case Center, which mainly features European cases, or the Ivy Collection. All of these can provide very useful background material that will get you more ready to view the organization. And you can also look for records in the popular press. Whereas Google may not always identify all possible references to an organization, LexisNexis, which is a database used a lot in the legal profession, can often be an excellent way of finding out more. And if you have access to a library like USF's, you can also look in specialized reports. For example, if you're dealing with an IT organization, it might be a good idea to see if Gartner has written anything about it. The last thing that you probably want to do if you're doing a research case before you visit the organization where you are hoping to do research is to determine if you are going to need to involve the institutional review board. And there are really no hard and fast rules for determining involvement. So what I'm going to do is just sort of give you an overview of the kind of principles that I use when I am advising doctoral student researchers. Very often, when we have a dissertation committee, the determination of whether to go to the IRB or not is in the hands of the faculty on that committee. So the faculty have to make a determination as to whether or not what you are doing constitutes human subjects research or not. And if it does constitute human subject research, you definitely need to go to the IRB. But how concerned the IRB is going to be about your research depends on a number of factors. So here are some of the factors that I would say almost certainly mean that the IRB needs to be involved, and that you better plan on some time, often 1 to 2 months, in order to get approval before you start any research, which might even include some of your initial visits to the organization. So IRB approval is almost certainly going to be required if you are planning interventions and looking at people's reaction to those interventions. There you're essentially doing an experiment, and if you're going to be observing behaviors before and after, that's definitely an area that the IRB is going to want to look at. That doesn't mean they won't approve it. It just means that they are going to want to look at it. They do not want to be ignored. If the questions you're asking deal a lot with feelings, or if they're likely to cause stress to the people being interviewed, that would be another situation where the IRB is really likely to want to give its input into your research protocol. Now, if the case investigation involves getting people to do activities that are outside of standard practice, this will be another major concern of the IRB. If you're doing something specifically for the purpose of your case research within an organization, and the organization would not normally do it, then the IRB is going to be interested. And if human reactions to situations are going to be central to the investigation, the IRB is going to be interested in making sure that you follow informed consent procedures. Finally, if there are a lot of concerns relating to privacy or anonymity that will emerge from your research, the IRB is going to be interested in that too. They may mainly be interested in how you're protecting the data, but that's going to be part of the IRB investigation. Now, there are many cases where it's a good idea to inform the IRB, but there's also a high likelihood that the IRB will say, no, you don't have to worry about this because you're exempt from IRB oversight. Now, some of the conditions that make it likely you will be exempt is if you may be observing interventions, but these are interventions being made on behalf of the organization. They're not something that are being implemented at your request. For example, if an organization changes price and routinely changes price, you would not be expected to have informed consent of all the people who are affected by that price change, but you might decide to observe it. If your questions are very unlikely to cause stress or discomfort, then the IRB is likely to exempt it. There isn't really any reason for looking at them. And this is particularly true if you are interviewing people for their knowledge and expertise as opposed to for their emotional reactions. If the observations being made are part of standard practice within the organization, for example, organizations routinely conduct performance appraisals. I'm not sure that anyone actually likes performance appraisals, and they can be very uncomfortable, but this is not something being done at the investigator's behest. And so you might be able to observe that process without necessarily having the IRB oversee your protocol, but they would want to be aware of what you're doing. If you're gathering data in accordance with normal organizational data gathering procedures, so if the organization, for example, routinely surveys its employees and the questions change from survey to survey, if you wanted to add a few of your own questions to that survey, chances are the IRB would not need to approve that, or oversee it, but they might want to make sure that the questions you're asking are not ones that are likely to cause distress. Finally, if everything you're doing is in accordance with existing organizational policies, the IRB may exempt you from further scrutiny. Again, this is because the IRB's role is not necessarily to change the way organizations behave. Indeed, that would potentially require the IRB to investigate itself. So as long as it's part of the normal rhythm of the organization, the IRB is likely to exempt it from requirements that you do very specific things, which are likely to be present if IRB oversight is required. Now, there are also conditions where the IRB is very unlikely to be involved, and most commonly it's because the particular thing you're doing is not classified as human subjects research. So if their data gathering is limited to archival records within the organization, you're not actually going out and acquiring data from individuals, then that doesn't fit human subject research. Now, the data may relate to human subjects, but as long as you are not inadvertently violating privacy, you haven't been collecting it, so it's not, what you're doing is not considered human subjects research. If all your interviews are with experts and the interviews are intended to elicit their expertise, i.e. get information about the domain where they're experts, then that is not going to be considered human subjects research. So an example they give in the human subjects research testing module is, if you're going to South Carolina to talk to an expert on the South Carolina shoreline, and you're going to be talking about the South Carolina shoreline, that's not considered human subjects research. At USF, we also have gotten a determination that writing a discussion case doesn't fall under the heading of human subject research, because we're just reporting on what we're observing. We're not manipulating anything. And of course, the control of whether or not the case is released is entirely under the hands of the organization. And for that reason, it seems that we don't really need to worry that much about the whole human subjects issue. Before you get permission to actually conduct a case investigation within an organization, you're going to need to basically familiarize yourself with the organization. In most cases, you're going to have a meeting. And what I recommend is that during that meeting, your main objectives should be just to get a feel for the organization and not to dive too deeply into your research question. Of course, if you're going to be developing a discussion case, I would have even more flexibility. But right now, when you're developing a research case, your focus is likely to be on just getting a feel. So some of the things that you might raise is, first off, get the individuals that you're talking with to give you a little bit more sense of the industry that the organization participates in, where the organization fits in that particular industry, and if you're dealing with a specific unit within the organization, where that unit fits within the organization. You probably want to get some background on the organization because it's often important to know where an organization has come from in terms of a current situation. And you also probably want to talk about what types of data sources might be available. Is there publicly available data on the organization? Are there private documents that you might be given access to as part of your research? in virtually all discussion cases, but in most research cases as well, you're going to have a central figure, which we'll refer to as the protagonist. And you might want to try to get a little background on that individual. This would certainly be necessary for discussion cases. In research cases, it may be that there are enough people involved so that the organization is the central focus. You may also want to talk about what type of situations are going on, what sort of interesting issues are being faced by the organization. In a discussion case development, this is going to be critical because that may be the decision that the discussion case focuses on. In a research case, you more want to get a sense of what's happening and how it might fit or not fit within your research. It's also important to notice that, in a research case, if you're working in an organization for a long time, at any point they might ask you to leave. And so one of the things you want to do is get a sense of whether or not this organization is going to be a good organization to work with. One of the faculty members who I worked with at Harvard Business School while I was doing my MBA spent almost 4 years working in an organization, and they had a change in CEO, and the new CEO said, no, I really don't want this research going on. And this faculty member literally lost access to all the research that he had conducted, and he ended up leaving Harvard and going to another school as a result. Now, another thing that you can focus on is, the possible topics for research that might be considered. And when you're doing discussion case research, then what you're mainly interested in is what questions are facing the manager. When you're dealing with research case development, when you're actually trying to come up with a research case within the organization, one of the things that you're probably looking for is how does the research that you're hoping to conduct overlap with the things that the organization feels important. Because if there is a lot of overlap, what will happen is it's going to be much easier for you to get permission to conduct the research, because the organization is going to be excited to have a researcher looking at a question that's of great interest to them. Understand that whenever you're developing a case, whether it be a discussion case or a research case, the organization is going to want some motivation. And if they believe that you're developing the case is going to have a positive impact on the organization, that is going to make things a lot easier to accomplish. And again, you also want to talk about possible data sources. In the research case world, triangulation is key. You want to get a sense of what type of access you may be able to get. Finally, I strongly encourage you to talk about what is going to happen to the case when it is done. And this is the question of case release, because what you do not want to have happen is to do a whole bunch of research and then discover that you're not going to be able to publish any of your data. And you are most likely going to have to explain the publication process to an organization, unless it's an academic organization that you're studying. And you want to make sure they understand it, and you also want to create within them a sense of obligation that if you go and do this research, that they will allow you to publish your findings. Now, it might have to be disguised, and those are things that can get negotiated later, but you certainly don't want to go into this without a clear understanding of the product that you are trying to produce. On the subject of disguising, there are really sort of 3 levels of disguise that you might present to the organization as being possible. One is essentially no disguise at all, a reported observation. You might change people's names so that they're not that easy to find on the website, but you're going to leave the identity of the organization within the case, and you're going to essentially simply report what you have seen. In a lightly disguised case, you make a few changes. You might change the organization's name, but you'll probably keep the industry the same. You might disguise financial figures for a discussion case. In a research case, it's more likely that you will simply establish a procedure whereby the organization makes it clear what is and what is not appropriate for publication. Finally, in a heavily disguised case, you might change the industry, you might change the location, you might change a lot of elements of the case. This creates some problems for a discussion case, but it presents a lot of problems for a research case, because if you are doing a research case, one of the things that your readers are going to be counting on is that the data that you are providing is authentic. And if it's heavily disguised, then you've added another layer of interpretation to the case write-up process, which is something that reviewers and readers will not appreciate. In terms of what you can do before or during the first meeting, there are a variety of pieces of information that are likely to be of interest to a potential case site, because at this point you're still sort of trying to sell yourself and sell the case research process to the organization that you're working with. One thing is you might want to present a biography, but you want to choose a biography that's in a format that the organization can understand. If it's an academic institution, they don't mind a 30-page vita because they're used to seeing that. But in a business organization, the expectation is your resume should be 1 or 2 pages at most. And so probably part of what you may want to do is trim down your vita into something that is more familiar to the organization. You want to clearly outline the objectives of the case. I would say maybe in a page or so. You're planning to do case research. What exactly are you interested in finding out? And why is that likely to be beneficial to the organization? You want to outline the case process, and in particular, you want to make sure that they understand at what points they can pull back and at what points they're committed. Obviously, once you start submitting your reports for publication, it's going to be too late for the organization to pull out of the process. And you just want to make them comfortable with the stages of the process and let them know when they can have input and how much control they're going to have over what you write. Now, when I'm doing discussion cases, I give them pretty much complete control over everything, including the point of walking away if they decide they don't like what's been produced. But when you're doing a research case, the investment tends to be much larger. And so you really need to think about this and make it very clear to the organization up front. As I mentioned when I talked about the case objectives, what you want to do is you want to try to clarify what the benefits of the case are going to be to the organization. And don't assume that they will be able to figure those benefits from your research objectives. So you want to try to be very specific. What is it that the organization can get from participating in this research that will be of benefit to them, that will be worth the kind of time that it will take? Do not assume that just the pleasure of collaborating with you or your academic institution is going to be sufficient, especially if the case is going to involve any significant commitment of time or resources. Finally, if you have a sample of what a case might look like, you could provide it to them. Now, in the case of discussion cases, this is relatively easy to do because most discussion cases are written in a way that makes them digestible to managers because they're designed for use in programs like MBA programs. When you start talking about research cases, it becomes a little different because they tend to be written more in academic jargon. So you have to think carefully about what you provide them. But don't provide them a discussion case if what you're going to be writing is a research case, because you do not want them to be surprised or disappointed by the product that you create. The final stage in preparing to conduct the research involves sort of clarifying the topic and process and getting formal permission to begin your research. So what you would probably begin by doing is recasting your research questions. Before you have a site, your research questions are likely to be extremely general. Once you have a site in mind, you can make the questions a bit more specific. The next thing that I would recommend doing is creating a sort of summary of your research plan that is going to be written in a way that the organization where you're doing your research can understand it. And some of the things that you would want to have in the summary is ensuring that you address the relevance of the problem that is being discussed to the organization and potentially to the research community, though that's likely to be less important for the organization. You want to describe the procedure through which the investigation is going to take place, including things like how long you expect it to take, how many people you will interview, how much disruption there is going to be. You really need the organization to understand that in advance. Chances are the organization will have some questions about why you're doing certain things. You might have two people conducting interviews in order to improve the reliability and get some inter-rater estimates. You need to explain that to them because a lot of times they may look at this and just say, well, that seems very inefficient. Finally, you want to emphasize how successful conduct of the research can benefit the organization and the broader research community. And the organization, of course, is going to be particularly interested in how it benefits the organization. Once you've got that document, which should give you a pretty good outline of how the research is going to be conducted, you need to get some sort of written approval. If the organization is not willing to put its approval in writing, then there's absolutely no guarantee that you will have that the organization won't pull out in the middle, or worse, pull out at the very end after you've completed your research, made your recommendations to them, and then have them say, well, that's very good, but now we can't learn anything more from you, so I think we will stop the process right here. I wouldn't try to make it as formal as a contract because that's going to involve legal, and that probably will take an extra 3 to 6 months to get it through them. But I would want to make sure that those people who are involved in the research know what they're getting into. You might want to inventory the existing data sources within the organization at this point. That's going to help you do things like estimate how long it's going to take, and will also give you a sense of how much analysis you're going to be able to perform with your research. And then finally, what I would recommend is creating a list of the ground rules that will need clarification after you've gotten approval and as you're beginning the research. You're never going to get all these things clarified before the research starts. There's always going to be a learning process as you're working with the organization. And so you want to think about those things, and then when you begin the research, you can clarify them. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the issues that commonly crop up in the next video, where I talk about the actual conduct of the research.